the differences between the golden rule and the categorical imperative. So the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The problem with that is that assumes that we know how people are going to want to act towards us, right? So some people say that a more appropriate way to put it, I've heard people call, I think George Bernard Shaw said, the platinum rule is to do unto others as they would have them do unto you. So the golden rule assumes that we know how somebody else wants to be treated. And that's kind of, if you think about it, that's kind of in conflict with what Kant is saying. Kant is not saying that we have an idea of how other people want us to treat them. Kant is saying that, look, you can't do anything that's going to take away from somebody's own autonomous responsibility and their rational choices to do something. So Kant says that, basically what you need to do unto others is you need to respect their capacity to make the choice for themselves, which is very similar to what Shaw was saying when he said do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Because in that formulation, Shaw is saying that we can't assume that we know what somebody else wants. Only they can know what they want, and they have the right to make that decision themselves. And that's exactly what Kant is saying in the categorical imperative. So I think there are some similarities between the golden rule and the categorical imperative. The one thing that it does assume, I suppose, the categorical imperative is that people are rational. So it assumes that we're all on the same wavelength in that capacity. So that's the shared bond that the golden rule seems to be pointing to. The golden rule seems to be saying that there's a commonality between us, which I personally believe that there is. I think we all sort of have similar moral sentiments, even though they're shaped by cultural factors. But the golden rule assumes that we all want to be treated the same way. Kant doesn't want to do that. Shaw doesn't want to do that. And Professor Geller apparently is an advocate of that as well. So yeah, that's the distinction that I would draw between the golden rule and the categorical imperative. The golden rule assumes that you know how other people want to be treated. The categorical imperative says you can't assume, and you have to give people the choice themselves. Okay. Some common objections that I saw to the categorical imperative in our discussion. One was it's a very famous example, and I posted it myself, that the murderer comes to the door, right? So you're protecting your friend or something like that in your house. The murderer comes to your door and says, do you know where so-and-so is? Do you know where Sally is? And now if you're following Kant's categorical imperative, it seems like you have a perfect duty to say, yeah, Sally's in my bedroom. But that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It doesn't seem like we want to sacrifice our friend to this murderer. And a French philosopher, Benjamin Constant, brought up this objection to Kant pretty much right away. Right as soon as Kant sort of published the categorical imperative, this is what Constant came back and said. And then Kant replied saying, yep, that's what you should do. You have a perfect duty to tell this guy what's happening, because if you don't, you're not respecting this person's autonomy as a rational individual to make a decision. Goes back to this whole thing that Kant is not concerned with the consequences of actions. That would be a hypothetical imperative, right? If you want to protect your friend, then you have to lie to the murderer. That's hypothetical. Kant wants to be categorical. Obviously, there are lots of problems with this, and we've talked about a lot of them in these discussions. But I think it's a noble pursuit that Kant is trying to do, and trying to say that, look, there are some rules that are categorically wrong. And, if we're going to create a rule of something, universal, I think what Kant is saying about we have a universal responsibility to respect other people's rationality. That's a pretty good start. Now, some of the consequences and the implications of that seem a little bit crazy to us, and that's something that we have to work out. And another thing to think about with these things is I don't think you have to say, I am definitely for categorical ethics and consequential ethics is wrong, or vice versa. I think that there are things that we can take from both situations when we're doing our moral deliberations and trying to decide what the right thing to do is morally. It's just another tool to add to your toolbox, to use a metaphor. Another thing that was interesting that people brought up was this idea. One was of warfare. In warfare, soldiers are using the other soldiers as means to the end. They're killing them as means to end to win the war, or spies, are deceiving other people as a mean to an end of protecting your country. And I think those are really good examples. Maybe the more relevant one is the spy instead of the soldier. Maybe not. But the question, I think, especially in the warfare example, the question we have to think about is Kant developed his system of categorical ethics for individuals. And it seems to me that when we're talking about the behavior of nations, of states, there may be different rules that govern the behavior between states and states and individuals and individuals. They're different entities, and it may well be the case that they should be governed by the same rules, but we can't make that leap yet. That's a very contested point in political philosophy, and that's something that we have to think about. But we shouldn't automatically make the leap to say that we're going to apply the categorical imperative to states' behavior towards one another, because I think that there are probably different considerations that are at play. But that's a really interesting point, and I think that's something that would make a really interesting paper topic if somebody wanted to write it on that. Can states or nations be held to the same ethical responsibilities as individuals? Great paper. So anyway, I don't know. That's an interesting question. We're going to leave that one on the table for now. Okay, so this week we're looking at The Law of the Peoples by John Rawls. John Rawls is a modern-day sort of deontological philosopher. He thinks that there are certain categorical principles that can be derived to govern our behavior towards one another. And the device that Rawls uses in his ethical reasoning is something he calls the original position. And the original position is it's a thought experiment. It's a hypothetical experiment that you conduct in your own mind when you're trying to make ethical decisions. And you say, okay, I'm going to put myself, let's say I can take all of my cultural, racial, regional, any kind of national identity, any kind of identity that you can identify yourself with. I'm going to strip all those things away from myself. And there's going to be me and, let's say 10 other people. Or 12. There's going to be a jury, 12 angry people, or a jury of 12 people, or whatever. And we're all in this position together. And this is before society has started. So, and we have no idea whether we're going to be wealthy. We don't have any idea whether we're going to be sick. We don't have any idea whether we're going to be disabled. We don't have any idea about any of our social standing. We're sort of all in the dark. We're all in this situation together. And we're behind something that Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is basically that. It's that we don't know what our social and political situation is going to be, cultural situation is going to be. So given that we're in this original position together and we're behind this veil of ignorance, what kind of rules would we make? If we know that there's a possibility that we could be poor or we could be rich, how do we decide what sort of rules that we should have governing the poor? Should we have a welfare system in place for the poor? It seems more likely, if we don't know whether we're going to be rich or poor, we're going to be more likely to choose a scenario where the poor are taken care of, where the disabled are taken care of. And this is something that Rawls calls justice as fairness. And this is what, in his famous book called The Theory of Justice, this is what he did to lay out his principles of justice and fairness. So that's what he does in his original work, Theory of Justice. In the Law of the Peoples, what he tries to do is he tries to apply the original position to international relations, to see if there's a way, okay, if we're in this original position together internationally, we don't know what country we're from, we don't know whether we're the majority, the minority, those types of questions. We don't know whether we're at war with one another, whatever. We're not privy to any of this particular information. Are there principles that we could derive internationally if we're in this original position together to govern international behavior? Rawls does put up three clauses, three preconditions that have to be in place when he's talking about the peoples. Okay, so the conditions are, in order to be considered one of the peoples, first you have to have a similar form of government. So we can say like Western Europe, maybe, democracy, this sort of idea of progressive democracy, working maybe even certain types of state-sponsored socialism with a system of rights and liberties and that kind of thing. Maybe we can lump all those in together. They also have to have a similar culture, or sort of I think, I'm trying to remember how, it comes from John Stuart Mill. He says something along the lines of a similar way of being, similar moral culture, something like that, similar culture, basically. So we can say, once again, we could say Western European, or we could say, maybe, I don't really want to say Asian because there are lots of different cultures in Asia, but you sort of get the picture there. Maybe Latin American could be another particular group of folks that share a similar culture. And then the final condition is that the people have to be moral. They have to be moral agents, capable of moral deliberations. So they have to share similar forms of government. They have to share sort of a similar way of life. At least they can understand each other. And they have to be moral. So those are the three conditions to be considered the peoples. And from that, Rawls derives 8 principles that he thinks can be applied to the peoples to govern their behavior together in a fair and an equitable way. So that's the article that you guys are going to be reading today, and then I'll post a discussion question on Thursday asking if you agree with Rawls' law of the peoples or not. You guys are doing a great job once again in the discussions. Please keep that up. And look for something this week from me regarding some sort of study material for the midterm, which will be next Tuesday. If you have any questions about the midterm or about anything in general, please feel free to shoot me an email. Have a great week.